Akeela Ahmed, MBE, she's a business leader. She's a social entrepreneur and equalities advocate. Akeela is also the founder of She Speaks, We Hear, and that's a platform established to amplify the voices of British Muslim women and challenging negative stereotypes. Dr Azim Ahmed is Deputy Director at the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK at Cardiff University. Dr Ahmed is an academic specialising in British Muslim communities and research interests including regional diversity and generational perspectives. Burhan Wazir, Editor-in-Chief of Hyphen Online. Burhan's an award-winning journalist and leads Hyphen, a media platform dedicated to Muslim life in the UK and Europe. And Rizwana Hamid, also a former journalist, produces, she's director of the Centre for Media Monitoring and has produced evidence-based reports on media bias and advocating for accurate and fair coverage of Muslims in Britain. So Burhan, I'm going to start with you. First of all, do you just want to give a sense of what kind of stories and perspectives Hyphen Online covers?
Thank you. I'm the editor-in-chief of hyphenonline.com. We launched about 3 years ago. One of the reasons why we were keen to launch a website in a very challenging media environment was that we felt that the role of Muslims in the UK and Europe was hugely underrepresented. The vast majority of stories in the mainstream press about Muslims tend to look at us from a security point of view or an Islamophobia point of view. We think there's a much more nuanced conversation to be had about access to healthcare, education, how Muslims kind of live their lives in a day-to-day experience, how they live in various communities around the UK, around Europe, access to politics as well. We're a kind of maturing Muslim population here in the UK and in Europe. People are involved in local politics, national politics, academia, for example. These are all stories that we are very keen to represent.
So, Burhan, you mentioned the stories that Hyphen cover. There are about 4 million Muslims in the UK, represented in every walk of life, in entertainment, culture, politics. I want to kind of go to you, Rizwana, because you do monitor the media. Do you think that's represented?
No. The simple answer is no. Obviously, our remit when we were set up was specifically to monitor the British media on how they report on Muslims and Islam. The last 18 months have been very much focused on what's been going on in Israel-Palestine. But when we look at our stats, we find that when it comes to online coverage, almost 60% of all articles are negative about Muslims and Islam. When it comes to broadcast, that's almost 50%. Over a third misrepresent and generalize about Muslims and Islam. And as Burhan said, the kind of theme under which Muslims are covered is terrorism, extremism, and, violence. And now, more so-called grooming gangs. So even though, in conversations with editors and journalists, and we engage constructively with the media, they say, yes, we want to cover the nuances of British Muslims in Britain. What we find hits the headlines and, the front pages or broadcasts are very stereotypical, negative, reinforcing those age-old tropes of, Islam being a threat to Western civilization, Muslim values are not compatible with, Western liberal values. Lots of tropes, women are oppressed, we're taking over. And when you see how, not just the media, we've seen very recently how politicians, have also been fueling Islamophobia, whether it's Suella Braverman talking about Islamists taking over Britain or Lee Anderson targeting Sadiq Khan about, him being influenced by Islamists. So the attack, what we find is whereas maybe a decade or more ago, all of these tropes were on the kind of dark corners of the web on far-right platforms, they are completely mainstream now. And Saeed Avasi's comment in 2015 of, Islamophobia has passed the dinner party test is true. Islamophobia is acceptable where other forms of racism would just not be acceptable, whether that's in the media, in the public domain, or anywhere else.
So I do want to look at the issue about the way women, particularly Muslim women, is covered. In recent days, we've had the issue of the burqa ban, which crops up every so often. What about, say, an issue like that, Akeela, when that comes up, when you have, say, Sarah Poshin in Parliament raising the issue? It's not the first time that it's come up by a politician for many, many years now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not sure if everybody heard, but I'm also the co-chair of the British Muslim Network, and I'm really pleased to be here today. Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite tiring and exhausting, actually, because every so often there will be debates about how Muslim women should dress or do dress, and they will be very much dominating the public sphere, as you said. Sarah Poshin raised it in Parliament. I don't think she's the first MP to mention it in Parliament over the years. And then what we saw, actually, quite surprisingly, was that Reform UK then actually set the agenda for the news cycle for the entire weekend. And we saw that then there were Conservative MPs who were then also debating this. I thought the Prime Minister was very good in kind of deftly sort of avoiding it at PMQs, the whole debate, because it's tiresome and it's actually a non-debate. What it is a coded way to talk about British Muslims, in a way which homogenizes them, stereotypes them, and dehumanizes them. And so often we see that Muslim women in particular and how they dress, their beliefs and their practices are weaponized in this way to demonize an entire community. As you said, British Muslims make up 4 million, nearly 4 million in the population in the UK. Right now, if we think about British Muslims, actually they are just like any of us in this room, I include myself obviously. They are contributing to society, they're shaping their society, they're going about their everyday lives in ways that are critical to our society. So if you think about education workforce, I think something like 2% of the education workforce are from a Muslim background, from Muslim heritage. That means at the front line, they're in schools, they're teaching, they're providing supportive roles. Similarly, the NHS, I think it's estimated that 3 to 6% of the NHS workforce comes from a Muslim background. That means they're providing everyday critical services. And this is across the board. If you look at transport, if you look at finance, you look at banking, all of these sectors, these everyday sectors, which are so important to running our country, are being shaped by and held up by British Muslims. And of course, beyond British Muslims as well. But yet in the public discourse, we only hear about the very small percentage of people that might choose to wear what is known in the public domain as a burqa. I'm actually a little bit confused about what people mean by a burqa, if I'm honest, because often it's so interchangeable. Sometimes it could mean somebody who wears something similar to what women are forced to wear in Afghanistan, or it could mean covering the face, or it could mean a headscarf. Some people use them interchangeably, some people are a bit clever. They say we don't mean a headscarf, we only mean the other things. And actually, you know, it just goes against all of our liberal, pluralistic, democratic values. I mean, do we want to be like Afghanistan, where we're telling people how they dress and imposing that on them? I don't think we do. I think there's a common ground in this country that we're not in the business of telling people, the state is not in the business of telling people how they should dress. And just to kind of end on that, I think Muslim women, going back to Muslim women in particular, you will find they're either stereotyped as being a threat to society, not integrating, disempowered, isolated, or they are stereotyped as kind of being a survivor, somebody who needs saving, somebody who's, you know, oppressed, somebody who is, beaten into submission. And both of those scenarios, they're never given the agency that other women in this country are afforded, albeit with all the kind of caveats of modern sexism and misogyny and what have you that we're dealing with. And so essentially, if I could just sort of say one more thing, we set up the British Muslim Network just earlier this year, myself and other people, about 20 of us from across the UK, because we wanted to try and ensure that the kind of nuanced perspectives that Burhan has spoken about, that Rizwana has spoken about, are actually reaching into the kind of higher sectors in society. They're reaching into policy, they're shaping policy, and they are kind of shaping the kind of public discourse, moving it away from this very binary, very polarized way of talking about British Muslims.
Okay, so I want to, Azim, maybe you could come in at this point, because it is about how do you, Akeela mentioned the British Muslim Network. How do you broaden those portrayals, do you think? Not just Muslim women, but Muslims in general.
I mean, it's a really good question, I think, because I think over the last decade or so, maybe, the kind of gap between communities on the ground, the way people are living their lives, the kind of stories that actually make a difference and impact on people's everyday, and then what's reported on those discourses and narratives, it seems to be getting bigger. And I think some of that is a loss of local journalism. Some of that is the kind of regurgitation of those stories that capture interest. And so, you know, the fact that the burqa's back in the headlines along with grooming kind of cases from about 10 years ago, and then they kind of go around in cycles in this way, which feels very repetitive. And so all the things you kind of have heard before, you hear again, and it kind of goes around in a circle with a new set of politicians and a new set of analysts. And on the kind of ground, communities continue to develop. You have a kind of growing Muslim population. You have increasingly Muslims who are now in different parts of industry and society and academia. And you have kind of new identities being formed in towns and cities across the UK. And all of that kind of misses the mark in terms of the kind of coverage we're getting, the journalism we're getting, and also the kind of documentaries and stories being told in television and other aspects. And I think, you know, part of the work of the Religion Media Centre, I'm sure, is to kind of try and connect those gaps a bit more, to kind of bring that journalism back to the ground of what's happening. But it's definitely a challenge, because I think whether it's Muslims, whether it's academics, whether it's community groups, they're constantly fighting this barrage of this world that exists only in the media, if that makes sense, only in certain types of journalism, certain types of commentary, and certain types of political discourse. And I think the distance between what's happening in reality and what's happening in discussion is just only, you know, getting bigger. How do you solve it? I'm not entirely sure. I do think we need to really look back at things like local journalism. I think that's really vital. And I think equally as well, there needs to be an opportunity for journalists to have the time to create the connections on the ground with communities that they used to have in this kind of idealized past, maybe, the time to do. But increasingly, it's kind of, you know, we need comment, let's Google the first person we can find. And again, without some way of differentiating between, you know, just popped out yesterday versus, you know, this is a really credible, long-lasting kind of organization with sticking power, you can't tell. And you just go to whoever you need comment from.
I just want to bring in something which, you know, when I was listening to you, just reminded me of last summer and the disturbances, riots that we witnessed. And I remember in the newsroom the next morning on our morning meeting, we have a very, very diverse newsroom. It was the BBC Asian Network. And it was incredibly somber. And some of the views that were coming through from the team, having come into work, having spoken to their families, was it felt like, you know, there was definitely fear. Some of their friends and family members who wore the hijab decided to stay at home. So I guess what I'm bringing in is, what is the real world impact of some of those media portrayals? Burhan, I caught your eye there. So
I was going to say, we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the riots. There's a real danger that we could see a repeat of what happened last summer. I think for us as a media organization, you know, one of the real challenges was persuading Muslims and frankly non-Muslims on the ground to speak to us, to explain what had happened. You know, if you're living in Liverpool and a hotel that was housing asylum seekers near you was set on fire and people almost lost their lives, we tend to forget time and time again, this isn't something that just affects the Muslims living in the area. It affects the non-Muslims living in the area as well. Both sides are kind of equally scared. And I think that's something that seems to be missing from a lot of the coverage of some of these communities. You know, some of these national tragedies that happen affect everyone and have a huge impact on people's daily lives.
So how do you engage then? Because I know, as a journalist who's often reported on Muslim communities, that's always been an ongoing struggle. Isn't there a community responsibility as well? Because otherwise it's kind of a circular thing. It's people don't want to come forward because they're worried about what's going to be said or how they're going to be portrayed. There is a mistrust of the media. I mean, that's definite. I've seen and heard it so many times. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Obviously, mistrust is there because of the way people are portrayed and the kind of...
But there is good journalism out there.
There is good journalism, but if repeatedly the narrative that's coming out is one that is negative, that is kind of placing people within the norms and of stereotypes and things, and that's the predominant narrative that's coming out, the good journalism just gets overshadowed. And so communities do mistrust talking to journalists and the media, and we've recognized this. And so, Centre for Media Monitoring, for example, runs Meet the Media sessions where we bring together editors and journalists, and we bring together kind of individuals and community organizations, one, to kind of bridge the gap, two, so that communities can understand editorial processes, but they can also hold the media to account. And then it's a networking session where, you do find spokespeople, experts that journalists can draw on. But I think there is a kind of a lazy attitude to say that, Muslim communities don't want to speak to us. Back in the day as a journalist, and I know that journalists don't have the luxury to do this now, you spent a lot of your time on the ground creating contacts, working within communities to build that trust up. And these days, Google is the search engine where we will go to find out information. So I think there is and I know that the kind of challenges in terms of resources that are placed on newsrooms now, which doesn't allow journalists to do the things that, we used to do in the past. But I think it's quite lazy to say, we just can't get hold of these people, or they just don't want to talk to us. I think invest in journalism to be on the ground, and then you'll get a more nuanced picture and a picture that reflects. But just picking up on Burhan in terms of Southport riots, I think, we saw the role that social media played there, but I think within Britain, what's really changed the landscape now is the kind of entry of GB News onto the broadcast landscape. And what GB News has done is normalize Islamophobia and given it a platform. And with the Southport riots, we found that despite the fact that Muslims were the victims, GB News were predominantly reported on Muslims as being the perpetrators. We saw lots of headlines saying, talking about attacks outside mosques, kind of framing of headlines which brought the focus on the mosques as if they were the perpetrators of the violence, as opposed to the mosque being, attacked. But GB News has an obsession with Muslims, and we found that over a 2-year period, they mentioned Islam or Muslims 17,000 times, twice as much as Sky News and BBC News put together. And the majority of that was negative. It wasn't saying Islamophobia exists and is bad, but it's about kind of cancelling it. And so I think we are in a really dangerous period where platforms like GB News and other kind of right-wing and some establishment newspaper outlets and columnists are normalizing Islamophobia and targeting Muslims.
I think, Akeela, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say and add to your point, Rizwana, is that as journalists, come and speak to Muslims about everyday issues. I think where you see reticence from Muslim communities speak to journalists is because we're tired of talking about the same old issues again and again. I'm tired of being asked about the burqa and whether it should be banned. I was on BBC Radio for Today programme in 2014, being interviewed by John Humphreys about this issue. We're now in 2025. The issue hasn't changed. The number of women that wear it hasn't changed. So actually talk to us about everyday issues. Talk to us about the concerns we have about education, health, transport, about our local communities, about the fantastic work that we're doing across the country in different ways. There's so much talent and expertise within British Muslim communities, and I really think journalists are missing those stories, and they'd be so interesting. And actually, I think when research is done, when you show that when nuanced and complex stories are highlighted, people engage with them, people like them.
Burhan, what are your thoughts there?
I mean, that's a central part of our reporting. That's one thing that I'm particularly proud of what the team has managed to achieve at Hyphen, which is that we look at most stories obviously through a Muslim lens, but our subject matter, our canvas is huge. We've published stories about how Muslims have been affected by long COVID. We did a series on housing a couple of weeks ago. We had a whole series on assisted dying, what Muslims think about assisted dying. We polled on that subject, So a lot of time and a lot of, I would say, unique research goes into reporting what we do. But as Rizwana said, it's no easy task. It costs money. It takes a lot of time. We spend, I would say we spend at least half of our time persuading people to come and talk to us and give us their stories, and it's a real honor to have people speak to you, but a challenge.
Azim, in our preparatory chat, you talked about young Muslims as well. And we're not sadly represented with too many young Muslims here, but it's in terms of how they view faith. But I think also certainly something that I've noticed, if we're looking at media, is really content creators as well. I mean, you've looked into this. What can you share?
I remember being young. I remember being a young Muslim too. I'm not sure at one point I stopped when exactly, but it wasn't too long ago. It's really interesting because I think there is this shift in media consumption, how it's done. And also, I don't think democratization is the word, because it's not exactly democratization, but you do have little pockets of kind of spaces online where people are engaging with very kind of constructed communities. And that applies to young Muslims as well as other different communities as well. And that kind of, again, is that distance between mainstream journalism and how people are engaging. But I think it's a really exciting space. I think one of the most interesting things about it is that it's kind of reforming different types of boundaries, different types of identities. I think it's alongside kind of broader shift in religious practice amongst younger populations. On one hand, you kind of have this resurgence of different forms of religious practices alongside a decrease in religious identification, and this is kind of with the non-Muslim young population. And then you have kind of, the more kind of standard growth of religious observance amongst younger younger Muslims, but also, say, black churches and kind of other parts of the religious community. And what it's kind of creating is a very different dynamic for religion than I think the majority of people from a previous generation, and even the generation before then, have kind of been familiar with. Sort of, I think our generation-ish is kind of multiculturalism. The generation before was a kind of no religion kind of idea of, religion becoming secularized. Younger people today, they seem to be operating on a completely different paradigm. And I think it's an interesting thing, because I think in 10, 15 years, they will be the ones who are sort of dictating where policy and coverage goes.
So I know that we are kind of running out of time before questions. In terms of sort of addressing the media portrayal, Rizwana and Akeela, you've talked a little bit about it, but I guess what are the ways forward?
Ways forward, I think, fair, accurate and responsible journalism is a very good way forward. I think scratching beneath the surface and finding the nuances of stories and representing communities, not just Muslim communities, but, marginalized communities better. I think engagement between the media and communities and journalists, and I think local journalism, unfortunately, hasn't died out, but has played a factor into why we are seeing less coverage in terms of communities accurately. I think the normalization of Muslims in the media would be one of the biggest steps. So, i.e., don't just bring Muslims on to comment on issues relating to Muslims, but as Akeela says, whether it's to do with genetics or astronomy or law or any other policy, we have experts in the field, bring people on. And I think Channel 4 does that quite well, to kind of give praise to them, because they tend to have representatives from many communities who are experts in different fields. So it's not difficult, it can be done. Those are a few of the things I would say.
So I'm thinking, should we reach out for questions now? Be a good time.
Thank you. I'm Fiona Moss from Culham St Gabriel's Trust. How do you think religious education in schools can be strengthened to show better understanding of Muslims, Islam, and the diversity that there is? And of course, that would be other religions and non-religious worldviews as well. And if something happened, what could the significance of that be?
Great question. I think religious education really needs to be put more in the foreground. I do think it's important. I think we're on the same page on that. In Wales, it's kind of been on a downward trajectory, and it's kind of disastrous, and it has been for a good few years now. It's kind of having a follow-on effect in higher education as well. So you kind of have less religious studies teachers in schools, and then you have less people doing religious studies in universities. And I think in the UK, more broadly, it's always kind of the afterthought subject. But frustratingly, it's like the core of humanities. The religious experience is the human experience. It applies to different communities. You can look at it from historical and sociological and textual perspectives and contemporary ways. And it's just such an intriguing way in. So I think I'm a big advocate for actually maybe having a good look at that and slowly implementing changes, nothing too drastic. I think that's a lesson we learned in Wales. But equally, I think it's something which does need to be addressed if we want to have the kind of coverage on religion, on communities we want, because often when we speak about things like religious literacy, it's such a basic skill required, not just for engaging with religious communities, but for just understanding different perspectives, understanding the humanities more broadly. So yeah, you can get me on that for a long topic, but I do think religious education is a kind of missing component to some of the challenges we're encountering more broadly.
Hi, thank you for this. It's been really enlightening. This may sound incredibly naive to everyone here, but you were talking about GB News and the detrimental effect they've had in the way that they talk about Islam and Muslims. GB News is largely owned by a very wealthy evangelical Christian from the UK, and I'm just wondering whether any interfaith approaches can be made to him, saying, look, this is your baby. Do you know what this is doing to another faith and the way people feel?
Rizwana, did you approach them when you did your report?
No, when we do our reports, we don't, because we're not a newspaper or a broadcaster. We're not asking for a right to reply, but they do have the right to respond to our reports when we publish them. But I think there are certain outlets that we haven't engaged with, primarily because I think we'd be banging our head against a brick wall. I just don't, they know what they're doing. It's a very clear agenda that they have. And therefore, and we saw in response to the report that we produced, they kind of rubbished it, even though we'd provided the evidence in terms of everything that we'd said. So I think, do we spend time trying to engage with them? Potentially, yes. Do I think it would have an impact? No. I think they have their remit, they know exactly what they're doing, and they're not going to stop doing it.
Hello, my name is Prabhu Guptara. I'm a publisher. And as a publisher, I'm very concerned about the state of journalism in the country. And that's why I've actually published a book on the subject, Saving Journalism, by a lady called Jenny Taylor. My point, the point that I want to explore with you is the following. One cannot expect commercially driven media to provide anything like fair representation for anybody. One can expect from media that sets out to be responsible, as distinct from commercially driven, to be responsible. The difficulty is that in our society, we are split between commercially driven media, which is interested in sensationalism, clickbaits, and all the rest of it, which is the mainstream, let's face it, and media that sets out to try to be responsible, but this tends to be driven by particular agendas, whether it's Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, or secular, whatever it happens to be. And the danger there is that these responsible media become defensive media rather than media that are really exploring the issues within these communities. For example, in relation to our first panel today, one would have expected the Christian media to break the story first, because they know their community, and they would surely have known the story. But was the story broken by the Christian media? No, it was not. Similar stories can be found in the Sikh community, in the Hindu community, in the Muslim community, I'm sure. But are such stories being broken by the media of these communities? No. These media tend to defend their own communities, be public relations agencies for these communities. So neither from the commercially driven sector, nor from the what we would expect to be responsible sector, do we really have fair, reasonable, solid journalism of the sort that is needed in the country. What is your response to my kind of provocative statement, please?
That is quite a provocative statement. I would say that's definitely a challenge. We're a small team of 20 journalists based in central London. One of our, to speak to some of your points, one of our challenges is how does a small team of 20 journalists cover the entire UK? We have Muslim communities living as far up north as Stornoway, up in the Outer Hebrides. We've got Muslims in Wales and Ireland, you know. So some of our reporters spend a significant amount of time traveling the country to cover some of these places. I think one of the issues is that, as a couple of the panelists here have mentioned today, there's a real crisis in local news, in local journalism. That's where many of the stories that you have just mentioned usually break out from. What typically used to happen was that a local newspaper would get a great local story. 2 days later, you would read about it in the national press. These days, that doesn't happen anymore. What's more likely to happen is it'll end up on TikTok or it'll end up on some other social media channel where it's not been fact-checked, where it's not been corroborated, and quite often it can lead to all kinds of disinformation. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the very real challenges that we face on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Akeela, Rizwana, Burhan, and Azim. Some really important points there. Thank you.